I think so.
Yeah, not too bad.
Just you. It's not me.
You going away?
Yes, not worth it.
Election like that.
Yeah. You going to stay for a bit of wine tasting?
Yeah, of course.
How's it? You driving down? Nice. I love that. I think they asked us to go around into local towns, try and local cuisine.
Whereabouts are you going?
Well, the thing where we're going is a place where lots of people get to on the floor.
Oh, wait.
The North French coast is all the coast. Basically, yeah.
Hope you're alright.
Where we're going is a place where we felt most French people go there actually for where Brits never go. Is you get to come to wild sandy beaches, dunes.
Sorry, I'm still responding. No. You do too. Well, slightly south of there.
Right,
Slightly in that.
it's very nice.
It's not there, I don't know, I haven't been up. It's alright.
Yeah. Some nice seafood. The place we stay at is a place called W-I-S. It's one of the very few French places which starts with Dublin. And the reason is, it used to be part of the British Empire, and it was originally called White Sands. And White Sands just became the Ruisseau. Wimereux. There's Wimereux, Ruisseau. They were all British towns until the 16th century.
You're going to capture it first.
Okay.
Exactly. Like your plant flag.
Yeah. It's quite fun. I mean, it's quite fun.
Oh, you've got in.
No, I didn't know anything about that. Can you do that? Because I think I'm kind of guaranteed to be ready to roll.
Yeah.
So I guess I mean, the first thing I've heard about that. I mean, I don't know. Right. Have a word with Grace, because I don't think it's been mentioned yet. So see if she thinks it's worth doing. I'm struggling at the moment to think, because she's just already messaged me saying she wants to get sort of almost consumer advice into my routine at the end. So it's going to be too much. I think. Do you mind having a word with her about that? Okay. Cheers, mate.
Lucy is asking if anybody wants to ask about the submarine captain, Lucy will be very happy.
Yeah, if anyone wants to talk about Scott Mills, then I kid. Just think, cometh the hour, you know. And one more if I may. After just taking a backstick on Iran in World War III. Oh, wait, it's a drink.
Yeah. The front page was reasonably sympathetic to Scotland. Well, they had that sort of, I suppose you're bashing the BBC on it, but the other friend from Piers Morgan saying it seems to be being done over twice for the same offence. Sort of thing. I was saying, like, my pet theory was that once the new Director General was clear out all the skeletons now. The last thing is come in and apply that whole ongoing sort of cases.
Well, they did all of those.
So maybe they, because it's Tim Davis last week, the job this week, isn't it? So you think if complaints are being reawakened, then you might get
Just over the desk. She was fine. She was fine.
just like forget what's in this. I mean, there was scandals, but you run a massive organisation which includes journalism and loads of showbiz people who are always by definition going to be slightly quirky and weird. And, yeah. But
It's a BNY line.
no. And also with so many media owners out there as well to look into all this stuff. Right? I think the BBC should just be a bit more realistic and say, look, like any massive organisation with HR efficiently as we can, which obviously they never do. I don't think the idea that Johnson Generalist was like every time
No.
some historic child
There has to be responses and like sometimes.
Appreciate the scrutiny and it's appropriate. I do think there's been disproportionate focus on lots of other incidents collectively told. I thought that, yeah, and I do feel sorry for you, but you're the biggest news provider and the biggest and a quasi-monopoly radio provider. Like, what? Even if you were just one of those, you would be incredibly important. All of them. Even if you leave aside the fact that we all come for it. Even if the content itself, like say for example, if I was like, okay, I come contest with and Vanguard. Those are like three options. Main channel. Let's specify which one. That's where it starts.
Good morning. The conflict in the Middle East has now entered a second month, and while we're working at pace for de-escalation and peace, it is now clear that the impact of this war will affect the future of our country. So today I want to reassure the British people that no matter how fierce this storm, we are well placed to weather it, and that we have a long-term plan to emerge from it a stronger and more secure nation. First, let me say once again, this is not our war. We will not be drawn into the conflict. That is not in our national interest. And the most effective way we can support the cost of living in Britain is to push for de-escalation in the Middle East and a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which is such a vital route for energy. To that end, we're exploring each and every diplomatic avenue that is available to us. The Foreign Secretary and the Chancellor have met their counterparts in the G7. The Defence Secretary has been in the Middle East speaking to our partners. And the UK has now brought together 35 nations around our statement of intent to push as one for maritime security across the Gulf. And today I can announce that later this week, the Foreign Secretary will host a meeting that brings those nations together for the first time, where we will assess all viable diplomatic and political measures that we can take to restore freedom of navigation, guarantee the safety of trapped ships and seafarers, and resume the movement of vital commodities. Following that meeting, we will also convene our military planners to look at how we can marshal our capabilities and make the Strait accessible and safe after the fighting has stopped. Because I do have to level with people on this. This will not be easy. I spoke with relevant business leaders in shipping, finance, insurance, and energy supply in Downing Street on Monday. And they were clear with me the primary challenge they face is not one of insurance, but one of safety and security of passage. So the fact is, we need all of this together. A united front of military strength and diplomatic activity, partnership with industry, so they too can mobilise once the fighting has stopped. And above all, clear and calm leadership. That is what this country is ready to provide. Because my guide from the start of this conflict has always been the British national interest. And freedom of navigation in the Middle East is in the British national interest. Let me turn now to the impact at home. Because I know that this is causing huge concern. People turn on their television, they look at their screens, they say explosions, infrastructure blown up, aggressive rhetoric. They worry that the UK will be dragged into this. We won't. But I also know that people have a deep sense that this will affect their family and their household. They can see it at the petrol pumps, and they worry about their energy bills. It is the job of government to meet these moments, not just with immediate action, but also with clarity about our direction. That's what I remember about the 1970s, when my family could not pay every bill. We struggled through the energy shocks and the price rises of that decade. But we always believed in the end that Britain would secure a better future for us. And I think that's what's been lacking in the crises of recent years. And I'm not prepared to ask the British people once again to go through a crisis, come out of it, and say, business as usual, back to the status quo. So on our economy, on our energy, and on our defence, This time will be different. We will make Britain a fairer and more secure country, because that hope is what is needed as the country comes together, and because how we emerge from this crisis will define us for a generation. So, as I set out a few weeks ago, we have a 5-point plan for the immediate crisis. We're cutting energy bills by over £100 per household today. We've extended the cut in fuel duty until September, and we're monitoring that situation daily. We're supporting people exposed to heating oil rises, setting aside £53 million for that. We're taking back control of our energy security by investing in clean British energy, because that is the only way we get your bills off the roller coaster that is controlled by Putin and the Iranian regime. And frankly, I'm sick and tired of your energy bills fluctuating up and down because we're on the international market, when if we took control of our energy and had homegrown renewables, we could stabilise your bills. And finally, as I say, we'll continue to push for de-escalation in the Middle East. But look, there's also a bigger argument here, because every one of these measures is part of a long-term plan to make our country more secure and more resilient to shocks like this. I mean, just look at what's happening today. Today, your energy bills will be cut because of the action that we took at the budget. And whatever happens in Iran, that price is now fixed until July. Today, if you need a prescription, instead of rising as they used to, the price will be frozen for a year. Today, if you're working on the national living wage, your wages will go up. Next week, on Monday, the state pension will go up. Next week, the 2-child limit will be scrapped, lifting 450,000 children out of poverty, the vast majority from working households. And next week, the biggest strengthening of workers' rights in a generation will become law, a huge boost to the economic security of working people. Now, some people may say, this isn't new, this was already planned. To which I say, yes, that is my point. Everything I've done in politics, certainly since the Ukraine war in 2022, is a response to this new and dangerous world. We campaigned for a windfall tax on oil and gas companies, which we extended. We focused on the cost of living, and we acted at the budget. And we've always emphasised the need for clean British energy. And we've invested because we knew that making our country secure in this world was the ultimate test that we would face, and our ultimate responsibility to the British people. Now, it's not going to be easy, clearly. And in the coming weeks, as you would expect, we will continue to assess the economic effects. We will continue to stand up for the British national interest. And we will continue to do what we must to guide our country calmly through this storm. However, it is increasingly clear that as the world continues down this volatile path, our long-term national interest requires closer partnership with our allies in Europe and with the European Union. Now we have made progress on this front, on agriculture, electricity, emissions trading, and more. But as the Chancellor has rightly pointed out, Brexit did deep damage to our economy, and the opportunities to strengthen our security and cut the cost of living are simply too big to ignore. So, in the coming weeks, we will announce a new summit with our EU partners. And I can tell you that at that summit, the UK will not just ratify existing commitments made at last year's summit. We want to be more ambitious. Closer economic cooperation, closer security cooperation, a partnership that recognises our shared values, our shared interest, and our shared future. a partnership for the dangerous world that we must navigate together. A world where this government will be guided at all times by the interests of the British people. Thank you. I will now take questions, and I have the BBC first. Henry.
Thank you, Prime Minister. As it stands, fuel duty is set to go up in September. You've said that's under review. I think today you said you were monitoring it. It is very hard to find anyone here in Westminster who seriously believes that you are going to press ahead with that. So if today was about reassurance, why don't you just give motorists that little bit of reassurance now and tell them it's not going to go up?
Well, fuel duty is set until September, as you rightly say, in terms of the cut. That will remain the position. The other measures that we're taking today, obviously energy bills are going down today, on average by £100 a household, and that will remain down until the end of June, whatever happens in the conflict. And I know people are concerned to know that that remains the case, whatever happens in the conflict. So let me be clear about that. And those that are heating their homes with oil are obviously getting support. We are keeping this under review. Obviously, a lot will depend on how long the conflict goes on, how quickly the Strait of Hormuz can be opened. And that's why I've made the statement I have today about the next step that we're taking, particularly on the Strait of Hormuz, which will be crucial in terms of what actually happens to energy prices and how long there's a spike in those prices. So that's the action that we're taking today. I've got ITV, Harry. Harry.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Harry Horton from ITV News. President Trump has said this morning that he's considering pulling the US out of NATO. You've just talked about looking at a new long-term partnership with the EU, including on security. Is this an acknowledgement that Britain's long-term security relationship with the United States is about to change?
Well, let me say a number of things in response to that. Firstly, NATO is the single most effective military alliance the world has ever seen. And it has kept us safe for many decades, and we are fully committed to NATO. Secondly, that whatever the pressure on me and others, whatever the noise, I'm going to act in the British national interest in all the decisions that I make. And that's why I've been absolutely clear that this is not our war, and we're not going to get dragged into it. But I'm equally clear that when it comes to defence and security and our economic future, we have to have closer ties with Europe. That's why we had the summit last year. This year, as I've just announced, there'll be a further summit. We will make good on the commitments that we put in place last year, but we will also go further in relation to the alignment. Thank you very much, Harry. I've got Lucy from Sky. Lucy.
Thank you. Prime Minister, you're talking here, of course, today about the cost of living. You said yourself, nothing in this speech is new. You've got the Australian Prime Minister earlier talking about slashing tax on petrol and diesel, telling people not to use more than they need. Can you be really clear to people at home listening to this? Should they be looking at changing their behaviours now? Well,
in terms of the situation, we're monitoring it carefully. We had a Cobra meeting looking at the ongoing impacts here in Britain yesterday. That is being monitored daily. I had the business sector in on Monday to discuss with them, this was shipping, finance, insurance, to discuss with them mainly how we deal with the Strait of Hormuz, how quickly we can get action there to get the supply open or fully open. And that is what we are doing. They're decisions that we think are right here, and we will continue to do that. But I emphasise, again, it's clear to me that the main determinant now of the impact is going to be how long the conflict goes on, and the question of how quickly we can get safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. And the two don't necessarily go together. In other words, I don't think it can necessarily be assumed that a de-escalation of the conflict necessarily at the same time brings the full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. And that's why we're moving to the next level of planning in relation to the Strait of Hormuz. We've been dealing with this for some time, but now we move to the next stage with the Foreign Secretary meeting coming up later this week, the first time we've convened that coalition, if you like, of countries. to look at diplomatic means, political means, and then the military planners coming together at a separate meeting to look at capabilities. Thank you very much, Andy. And I should say, Andy, congratulations to your daughter on the gold medal, I think, that she's just got.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Prime Minister. Prime Minister, actually following on partly from Lucy's question, I mean, in other parts of the world, there is much more of a sense of leaders preparing their populations to say, this is hard, you may have to do things differently. Yet from your government so far, we've heard behave as normal, even book your summer holidays as normal. Isn't it time maybe to address the British people and say, perhaps we have to start thinking about our behaviour in a different way?
Well, a number of points in response to that. Firstly, there are a number of measures we're taking. The direct measures in relation to energy price, the support for oil, fuel duty. The wider measures, most of which come in either today or this week on the cost of living, which are not a response to this particular conflict, but are a response to the fact that the cost of living has been the number one issue in our country for a very long time. And I'm conscious that whatever's going on in the world, whatever's going on in politics, that remains the number one issue. In relation to the situation, we are monitoring it very carefully on a daily basis. Our assessment it looks at supply, looks at the impact on our economy, and we'll keep the measures we've got in place at the moment. I'm absolutely convinced that the most important thing is de-escalation. The most important thing is getting the Strait of Hormuz back fully open, and that's why we're putting a lot of effort into the next stage of that and really pushing forward. And as I've said, we're prepared to take a sort of leadership role in that as the United Kingdom in relation to the Straits of Hormuz. Thank you, Andy. I've got Paul for Channel 4. Paul.
Morning, Prime Minister. Look, most of the measures you're talking about were already in place before this war kicked off. So far, you seem reluctant to talk about specifics for help because of this war. And the criticism is that you've been dithering. So have you been dithering, or yes or no, do you have in mind a fixed set of plans for the hardest hit by the cost of living crisis caused by this war? And if so, when can we expect to hear them? What are the key indicators that will make you say, this is what we've got planned for you?
Yeah, let me just answer that. Firstly, a lot of the measures on the cost of living were measures that were taken at the budget last year, so we were ahead of this. Most people will be watching on their screens, worried about the damage they're seeing, the explosions they're seeing, the conflict, but they will also have this deep feeling inside, this could affect me. And what they mean by that is it could have an effect on the cost of living. We've been saying the cost of living is the single number one issue for a very long time. So it's not a coincidence that the measures coming into force today are on the cost of living, because I've been clear that that is the central issue, and that is I think for most people in the country, that's the thing they're probably worrying most about today. So we're actually ahead of the game in relation to that, because we took those measures at the budget. The only reason energy bills are coming down today by an average of £100 is because of the measures that we took at the budget, and they'll be down for 3 months. So those measures have been taken. In relation to what might be needed later in the year, obviously we're working through contingencies. A lot of it will depend on how long the conflict goes on, how quickly the straits are open, because it's very difficult to assess at the moment what might be needed, say, in the winter, until we know the answer to that question. So we're looking at a number of contingencies, as you would expect. I think it's important to point out that whilst there will always be a concern about energy bills, I think people will begin to really worry when it gets to the autumn energy bill, because the summer bill, which is the next one, tends to be, on average, about 7% of the energy people use. It doesn't mean they're not worried about it, but I think most people will be looking to what's the one that comes when it gets colder later in the year. So we're working across all of that. But in the end, the focus has to be on de-escalation and getting the strait open. And that begins to answer the question of what is the nature of any support that may be needed. Clearly, we want to make sure that we act for everybody in keeping the price down, the cost down. And today's measure on energy bills is a measure for everyone. But equally, in terms of tailoring support, we need to make sure that nobody is left behind here. Thank you very much, Paul. Natasha from LBC. Natasha.
Natasha Clark from LBC. The head of the House Oversight Committee, which is investigating the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein, has called on the King to meet those victims. Do you think there is a moral case for doing so? And if I may, you've obviously outlined today on the cost of living all of what you're doing, which I'm sure listeners will welcome. But just 10% of the public think that the government is doing well. Why do you think that might be?
Well, let me deal with the important point you make at the end there, because one of the things that's really important for me to get across to the public is that their bills are coming down by £100 on average, and they're staying down until the end of June, whatever happens in the conflict. And I repeat that for a reason, and that is because I'm not sure everybody has heard that. It is really important for them to hear it, and I want as many people as possible to know that that's the case, because I know they're going to be anxious. And when I have said it to people, there's been the secondary question is that actually going to hold even if the conflict goes on? And the answer to that question is yes. So my job is to make sure that I get that across to the public, because that is the measure that comes into effect today. In relation to the King, I think it's important to appreciate this is part of the 250 celebrations that are in place. So it's a long-planned visit, and the US and UK are close allies, have been for a very, very long time. But this is a visit that, as I say, has been long planned and is part of the 250 celebrations. That's where the focus of the visit will be. Thank you very much. Gabriel Nussbaum, please.
Hi, good morning, Prime Minister. I'd like to zoom out a little bit to the wider elements of the cost of living crisis, specifically the one affecting the young generation, who were simply told, go to university, get a job, buy a house. We see today houses on average 8 times salary, student loans, very relevant at the moment. Jobs are either unavailable for young people, or if they are, there's no security. The pension system compared to previous generations is completely different. Salaries not keeping up with the cost of living crisis, and childcare costs through the roof, putting people off or delaying starting families. I'd love to ask you to share a message to this young generation, perhaps more to look at an element of hope and confidence looking forward to the future.
Yeah, well, let me give that, and let me tell our young people we've got their back. And all of the points you raise are really important, whether it's home ownership, where the average age of home ownership has gone up because of the inaction of the last government. That's why we're building more homes. On childcare, childcare is now free from 9 months to 4 years, makes a huge difference for young people with young children. In terms of the money it saves them, their ability to get back to work. And on that question of getting into work, we're putting in place what we call a youth guarantee, which is a strong support from the government to help people into work and support them into work, because all the evidence is if they are able to get into work, even for a relatively short period, the likelihood is that they will then go on from there with a secure job into the future. So all of those measures are in place. But it's really important you highlight the impact on young people, who I think will feel that they've been let down over the last decade and a half. And we need to put that right. Thank you very much. I've got Jessica from The Guardian. Jessica.
Morning, Prime Minister. I wanted to pick up some of what you said about close relationships with Europe. Do you believe, you said before that you don't think it's right for the UK to rejoin the customs union. Are we heading towards more of a rejoining of the single market? Is that something you think would improve Britain's economic future?
Well, I do think that we should strengthen our cooperation on defence, security, energy, emissions and the economy. And on the economy, the steps we've taken so far have been in relation to the single market. And I'm ambitious that we can do more in relation to the single market, because I think that's hugely in our economic interests. Obviously, this is a matter of negotiation and discussion with the EU, but the summit we have this year will not just be a stocktake summit where we look at actually the 10 strands that we put in place last year. It will be a deliberate ambition on our part to go further than that and to cooperate more deeply, including in the economic sphere. So thank you, Jessica. I've got Jack from The Sun. Jack.
Hi, Prime Minister. Jack Elson from The Sun. Can I just pick up on that point? Do your manifesto commitments not to rejoin the customs union, free movement or single market still stand? And you previously said from this podium that you wouldn't be forced to choose between tethering Britain closer to either Europe or America, but it does seem that you are engaging with closer negotiations with Europe and you have a deteriorating personal relationship with Donald Trump. So is it fair that you are actually choosing Europe over America?
Well, manifesto commitments remain, but we made it clear in the manifesto that we wanted a closer relationship with Europe. So that is perfectly consistent with our manifesto. I'm not going to choose, because I think it's in our interest to have a strong relationship with the US and with Europe. But I do think that when it comes to defence and security, energy, emissions and the economy, we need a stronger relationship with Europe. I actually think that will help strengthen our relationship with the US, because successive presidents have said that Europe needs to do more on their defence and security. I've long argued that with European colleagues, that we should be doing more. And that's not just, for example, on defence spend, although it is on defence spend. It's also on how we spend, how we collaborate, cooperate. And that's why I've focused on deals, for example, that we've done with Norway in relation to frigates. Really good deal, very good for trade, very good for jobs in the Clyde, but really importantly, interoperability of the frigates. We can have our crews on their frigates, they can have their crews on our frigates. That, to me, is the future of a stronger European defence, which is bringing together the capability that we've had. So we don't just get each country developing its own capability. It's an ongoing discussion. I spoke at the Munich conference about it. I spoke at the JEF meeting about it last week in Finland, that we have to go beyond just a numbers game and be much more integrated in the way that we work on defence and security. Thank you, Jack. And I've got Joe from Bloomberg. Joe.
Prime Minister, President Trump said yesterday that he wouldn't come to the aid of the UK anymore in his Truth Social post. How seriously do you take that threat from our main ally?
Well, it's very important that we're clear. There's been a good deal of pressure on me to change my position in relation to joining the war, and I'm not going to change my position on the war. So whatever the pressure, whatever the noise, I'm the British Prime Minister and I have to act in our national interests. I should say that on defence and security and intelligence, we're obviously working closely with the US, as we always do. And in relation to the planning on the Strait of Hormuz, of course, that involves talking to the Americans as well. So, as I say, whatever the pressure, whatever the noise, my job is, as British Prime Minister, to concentrate on what's in the British national interest. That's what's guided me through this conflict so far. It will continue to guide me as we go forward. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.